Future Sense is a podcast edited from the radio show of the same name, broadcast on Bay FM in Byron Bay, Australia at bayfm.org. Hosted by Nick Jeans and well-known international futurist Steve McDonald, Future Sense provides a fresh, deep analysis of global trends and emergent technologies. How can we identify the layers of growth, personally, socially, and globally? What are the signs missed, the truths being denied? Science, history, politics, psychology, ancient civilizations, alien contact, the new psychedelic revolution, cryptocurrency and other disruptive and distributed technologies, and much more. This is Future Sense. You are now tuned to Future Sense with myself, Nick Jeans, and my co-host, Steve McDonald. Good morning, Steve.
Good morning. Wonderful to be here again, Nick.
Yes, and we just heard the news there. There's always negative stuff in the news. That seems to be the predominant thing that people focus on with news reporting, north, east, west and south. But there's other things going on in the world. We're going to focus a bit on some positive signs of change today.
That's right. We're going to look at signs of progress, in particular signs of emerging new human values, new ways of being human that are more complex and more capable.
Very good. And folks, just remember that you can text in at any time to our text line. Comes up on the computer right here, 0437 341 119 or 0437 34 119. That'll confuse you. Please text in, and anything you'd like to say, contribute, or bring our attention to, we'd love to hear from you. Wonderful. You're tuned to Future Sense with Nick Jeans and Steve McDonald. Engage, emerge, activate, and spiral up. 9:14 here on Bay FM 99.9, and you're tuned to Future Sense with myself, Nick Jeans, and Steve McDonald. And we're looking at signs of change, the emergence of new values and new ways of being. Some of those signs that we can point to as a positive indication of the transition to a new paradigm in our consciousness, in our beingness on this planet. In fact, a big task, but it's happening.
It is happening indeed. There are multiple shifts underway all around the world, and not only the shift from the modern scientific industrial era to what's emerging, which some people might call postmodern, that it's a humanistic, network-centric way of being human. And that is obviously the headline, but there are lots of other shifts underway as well. In fact, pretty much every society around the world is changing in its own way.
Yeah. And
depending on its starting point, whether it's starting from a traditional tribal way of living, or perhaps a martial conflict-based way of living, or an agricultural way of living, all of these societies are going through change, and it's a result of many, many different things. I guess you could generalize and say an increase in the complexity of life conditions is what Claire Graves would say.
Yeah.
From his research, and those life conditions are all encompassing. So they include what we've created ourselves in terms of our physical life conditions. They include our psychological life conditions, so the sum result of our psychological history, what that's brought us to today, how people are thinking around the world, and also life conditions from off the planet. So the influence of our sun, the influence of this particular part of the galaxy that our solar system is flying through at the moment. And that includes, as discovered by the NASA Interstellar Boundary Explorer mission, which is their Voyager spacecraft, the fact that we seem to be crossing into a new part of our galaxy right now. Our solar system is transiting out of what's called the local cloud and entering into another part of the galaxy called the G cloud, which is different ambient weather conditions.
It's not to be confused with the G spot.
No, not at all. Although there may be a spot in the G cloud that we haven't discovered yet.
Exactly true.
We'll keep an eye out for that. So what we're going to have a look at here is some of the more obvious things today.
Yeah.
And these are the things that quite typically don't make the headlines in the news. As you said earlier on, the news often focuses on what's wrong, what's dramatic, and there are lots of things that are changing and things that are emerging in the world which are evidence of more complex ways of thinking and being, evidence of new, more cooperative, more community-oriented values. And also there are some hidden signs which most people probably wouldn't notice, which come from the non-linear dynamics of complex systems, and we won't talk so much about those today because we often talk about those anyway, and often those signs are in an obvious sense taking us in what seems to be the wrong direction, but because of the complex nature of these different systems and the way that they operate, then sometimes they go backwards just before they go forwards. So we might touch on that briefly, but mostly we're going to look at the obvious things. Yeah.
Can I just mention quickly, because as you're talking, I'm thinking about, as you said at the beginning there are different changes going throughout the world, wherever people and communities, societies, nations are situated generally in their layer of development and evolution. They are emerging, and you can think right now of the battle, so to speak, or the issue between Hong Kong and mainland China as a good example of this. And we talked about this off air a little bit, that Hong Kong, having been a British protectorate for all those years, clearly had a much more Western influence, clearly had a lot more freedom, clearly had a lot more financial freedom and a lot more other aspects in their population, growing up in an education system which was, I guess, more Western and so on. And they're coming up against now, after 20 odd years of being back under the umbrella of China proper, mainland China, the pressure to submit to what looks like these extradition laws, somewhat arcane and backward looking in terms of the perspective of how the Chinese mainland and the Chinese government in particular sees things, coming from an earlier stage of evolution, you could say. So there's this contest between Hong Kong and China in a sense that is very much an example of what you're saying, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it was always going to be a problem because of those things you just mentioned. The political system in China really, and everything we say on this show is a generalization because there are so many different complexities and unique conditions around the world that we can't speak to all of them. So in a general sense, the Chinese communist system of government is evidence of a former era, a paradigm from a Western perspective, which has really come out of the agricultural era. It's a relatively rigid system, although certainly in recent decades it's loosened up a hell of a lot because it's evolving itself. Yeah. But Hong Kong being under Western influence and being a free country, and also one of the world's amazing melting pots, where so many different cultures came together, and it was a crossroads for travel and all those sorts of things.
Yes, my mother used to call it honkers. She used to go there all the time. The honkers.
Yeah. And that kind of complexity is juice for evolution, for development, and so it was always going to be an issue with the Hong Kong going back under Chinese mainland control, and we're seeing that values clash now, and the people who've enjoyed freedom up until recently are now pushing back against some of the more rigid controls which are trying to be put into place. And I guess from a mainland China perspective, they're trying to reel it in and get it under control.
It's interesting too, because in terms of Claire W. Graves' work, which we refer to often here, and if you haven't listened before, you can listen back to our other podcasts at futuresense.it for some of the previous podcasts where we talk about all these things. But in terms of Graves' work, it seems to me that that Hong Kong has been very, very layer 5, which is the orange layer, for most of its history under British protectorism, and now in a sense it's with up to 2 million people, possibly they're saying, in the streets at the moment or yesterday. That seems to be an emergence into a more communal, into a network-centric organisation against this older Chinese formulation.
Yeah, absolutely. So with everything going through change, we should expect Hong Kong to be transitioning from 5 to 6, which is from the modern scientific industrial, which has been the dominant paradigm for the last few hundred years, into this more network-centric, humanistic, human values-centered way of being. And for China itself, of course, its dominant shift at the moment is probably from that more rigid sort of agricultural, very structured, controlled kind of way of being into a more free market, modern scientific industrial way. And certainly that seems to be evident from the widespread industrialization and the power of China that's emerging as a very dominant country globally. And these things are, like I said, these are generations. There are lots and lots of complexities. One of the things that makes it really interesting is the new technology, which is coming out. And we have this thing called a trickle-down effect with technology. So some of our technologies are quite advanced, and they'll emerge out of centres which are relatively developed or relatively evolved. So there's very complex thinking that leads to the creation and distribution of this technology, and those technologies then become available to everybody. So you've got people in what are still very much traditional tribal village type living scenarios who are getting smartphones and getting on the internet and those sorts of things. So it's it creates a very, very rich and interesting situation.
Indeed, it does.
Yeah.
And of course, I hesitated there because immediately I popped into my head 5G, and we're not going to go to 5G today, but that all these technologies are interfacing and coming together in a variety of ways. And as Steve is saying, we always say the complexity of the system is really what needs to be acknowledged and focused on in a way. There's no simple one way that things are. And that's exciting too, because it gives opportunity always for choice and change to emerge out of how we approach with awareness and consciousness what's actually going on the planet.
Yeah, so what I'll do now is I'll just walk us through. We'll focus on the emergence of Layer 6 from Claire Graves' model, which is this quite obvious at a global level emergence of a very human-centered perspective. Many people are calling this the anthropocentric era for that reason.
Yeah.
And so we're looking at everything from a very, very human perspective. I mean, that sounds like an obvious thing, but there's a turning inward with the emergence of this particular set of human values. So we're taking a lot more notice of ourselves, who we are, how we're showing up in the world, what we need to change about ourselves in order to adapt to what the world is calling for from us. And some of the key themes that are emerging with this particular layer, and the changes from the Layer 5, the modern scientific industrial, into this Layer 6 can be traced pretty easily back to the mid-1800s at least. Probably it started before then, but that was when it started to become obvious within society. And the key driver of this particular way of being human is a desire for deep and meaningful human connection.
Yeah.
A desire for everybody to be noticed, everybody to get their fair share of things, everybody to have their own voice.
Everybody to be an Instagram star.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also characterized by an expanding perspective on the world. So from the modern scientific industrial standpoint, we looked out at the world and we saw the world as a collection of opportunities that we could potentially explore and exploit. And we would look at all those different opportunities and try and choose which was the best option for us to follow. So it was a multiplistic way of thinking. That's what Graves called it. And we're moving into what is a relativistic way of thinking. So rather than having one sort of standpoint and looking out from there, we're now moving into a way of being human that allows us to move our place of observation around and put ourselves in someone else's shoes, figuratively, and without moving from our lounge chair, we can literally do that, put ourselves in someone else's shoes on the other side of the world.
The wisdom of the moccasins, as you referred to before.
Yeah, it reminds me of that Beatles song, Without Going Out of My Door. We'll come back to it and maybe play it later on. So some of the themes that we're seeing showing up, and we'll look at some examples of these later on, calls for social justice and equal rights. These were some of the earliest things that really showed up as changes in society back in the mid-1800s, and we saw these social justice movements emerging around women's rights, racial equality, those sorts of things. A flattening of hierarchies. So it's looking back at the modern scientific industrial era. One of the things that looks wrong to many people now is the idea that power has been centralized and these hierarchies have been built, and the most benefit has gone to the people at the top of those hierarchies.
Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yeah, and the wealth is sort of filtered to the upper end of the hierarchies, those sorts of things. So there's a strong desire to want to flatten hierarchies and for people to have more input from all places within society, to break down those layers of society. Networking in general. So we've had the emergence of networking technology, which has really come out of Layer 5, and it's one of the obvious examples of how a paradigm will solve the problems of the previous paradigm, but then it will create new problems. And so Layer 5, the modern scientific industrial, has created a problem for itself through network technology. And that network technology has increased complexity, and it's driven the evolutionary tension that's causing the emergence of a new way of thinking, a new paradigm. And just a brief look at the status of social network sites, for example, around the world at the moment. Facebook stands out as by far the largest, with about 2.3 billion users at the moment. And I'm quoting from a website called Statista.com.
Statista.com, yes. YouTube comes second with 1.9 billion followers.
Yeah, followed by WhatsApp, 1.6. Facebook Messenger gets its own line near 1.3
I hate
billion.
Facebook Messenger.
And then in order, going down in order, WeChat, Instagram, QQ, which I don't even know what that is, to be honest, Qzone. So there's a few here that are obviously not on our radar, but Qzone, TikTok, Sino, Weibo, Reddit, Twitter. And
I'm surprised that WeChat is there. That's the Chinese one, isn't it?
I think so.
So that is up there,
Yeah. So
what does that indicate to you? I mean, that's a lot of people involved in these platforms, of course, as we're saying, and there's networks. They're essentially networks.
Yeah, exactly. And so, there's a good slice of the global population which is already living in a networked way. And that doesn't necessarily mean that their values are reflective of layer 6, because people will use these networks for many, many different reasons. And no doubt there would be a full spectrum of human values within the user sets of these particular networks. But just the fact that the networks are there, that they're becoming so dominant in terms of their involvement in the way that we live life and their influence on society, is a reflection that this new network-centric way of being human, this layer 6, has already emerged quite significantly. And although it's still obvious that the controlling influences on the planet, so the people who are sort of driving the dominant economic paradigm are still operating from layer 5, we're getting very, very close to a tipping point now, which I'm predicting will come roughly within the next sort of 10 years or so.
Because while those platforms have been of great benefit, as we're saying, they've solved a lot of problems. They've networked people together. They've given the opportunity to share yourself, share information, to understand, to know things instantaneously around the world. It's also, of course, been fraught with things like fake news and the manipulation of the algorithms, and we're seeing a lot of that. So a lot of the emperor has no clothes. It's been revealed. We're seeing the shadow puppetry, so to speak, behind the scenes. So there's those two things operating at once. So it's not all good. It's certainly not all bad. It's a transition to something. That's, I guess, how we would see it.
Yeah, in the overall scheme of things, if we look at this trajectory beyond the modern scientific industrial era, we're really still in the collapse phase at the moment, and that's going to continue for some time. Probably the best guess I can make around a tipping point, and it's, the tipping points are never so clear. It's not like you can point to one day on the calendar and say this was the day that the global paradigm shift happened. But
we used to imagine that sort of thing back then, that the eschaton.
Yeah,
the word for the eschatology.
That's right.
The end times.
Certainly in the lead up to 2012, a lot of people thought that was going to be it.
Yep.
And it was all going to shift in one day, but that's never the case. These things are always fluffy and blurry, and they happen in different places at different times. So it's very hard.
Some people have got a lot of cans of baked beans stored away.
That's right, and bags of rice too, I expect, which can be quite handy. So some of the other characteristics that are showing up in society, things like the desire to share knowledge, and that, one of the early sort of manifestations of that was the idea of data sharing on networks and those sorts of things, analysing big data from a layer 5 perspective. But everybody wants to share now, and your comment about Instagram before is an obvious example of that. Decentralisation generally is a huge theme. So the previous paradigm, the modern scientific industrial, has been very centralised, and we're now moving back to a decentralisation as a way of reorganising society in general. And consequent to that, we're seeing a relocalisation of most things, which is showing up as people wanting to move out of cities, go back to villages, rebuild the local village, those sorts of things, rebuilding the communities around the villages, the local resourcing of everything. People want locally grown food, particularly organic food is becoming very popular. Locally produced energy, and really as many things as possible. People want to have that security of actually knowing the people who are providing their things, rather than having their supplies and their provisions come through long supply chains from countries on the other side of the world where they don't know, what kind of conditions were present during the preparation or the growing of those particular foods and things. Yeah,
exactly. Well, one of the articles from Nielsen is about sustainability in the consumer packaged goods, the CPG landscape, which is evolving. Consumers aren't just demanding that companies make changes to better the world, they're also making a few adjustments themselves. The majority, 73% of global consumers, say they would definitely or probably change their consumption habits to reduce their impact on the environment, and that obviously the best way to do that is to relocalize as much as possible. That doesn't mean that every sustainability trend provides an equal opportunity for growth. There's a wealth of sales trends globally that show that products living in the sweet spot of healthy for me and healthy for the world are growing in demand.
That's right. And on my list of emerging themes there, the next thing is ecological awareness, which is showing up in that example that you just quoted there. Yep. So there's a general desire to want to reconnect with nature. There's a perspective that the scientific industrial era has disconnected us from nature and made us think that we're separate from nature, and that is rectifying itself. And certainly a strong desire to want to repair the obvious damage that we've done on the planet through our various exploitation of resources and dumping of garbage and those sorts of things which have happened out of the scientific industrial era, which produced an awful lot of garbage. I mean, that the whole industrialization of things and packaging and all that kind of stuff has produced a hell of a lot of garbage, and it's making a big mess.
And we're seeing a lot of technologies which are starting to reuse, to reconfigure that garbage in various ways, including I heard an interesting piece about clothing, secondhand clothing, how that can be made into, I think not all materials, but many materials into small pellets, which are then used in some other way. I can't remember the number of ways that they've been utilized. So, the potential for that incredible amount of waste on the planet to be reconfigured in one way or the other is growing at pace.
You've made me and all the listeners curious about what those pellets of clothing are actually
I'm just trying to remember because
you'll have to look that up.
I'll have to look that up. I will. In fact, in a recent global online survey from these same articles, a whopping 81% of global respondents said strongly that companies should help improve the environment. This passion for corporate responsibility is shared across gender lines and generations. Millennials, Gen X, Gen Z are the most supportive, but their older counterparts aren't far behind. So that's interesting, isn't it?
It is interesting too, and it's busting an old sort of thought bubble that we used to have about values being pegged to generational shifts, and the whole generation gap thing was a very common discussion topic, but it was a limited perspective, a partial truth, because these value shifts that we're talking about don't necessarily relate to a particular age group or a particular racial group or a particular sex or anything like that. They are, as best we can understand, evident across the board, and it really comes down to the complexity of life conditions. So even if you're a person in the later years of life, if your life conditions change, then potentially your values will also shift in the same way that young people are coming through with different values about these things. So it's available to everybody.
Yeah,
is a good way to look at it. The last thing I've got on my list here for the emergence of this sixth layer of being human is an inward focus. So our focus is turning from the previous perspective we had in the modern scientific industrial era of looking out at the world and wanting to change the things out that we see in the world.
Or utilise the things out there.
Yeah.
Use them in some way.
Yeah, adapt the outside world to suit ourselves. We're now looking inside, and so there's an increased focus on personal development. And we saw the early stages of that come in the later stages of the fifth layer, the modern era, where it became about being the best that you can be. So it was an early sign of this shift into layer 6, where people in the modern world really wanted to focus on improving themselves and making themselves better. And now that's going to a deeper level with the emergence of layer 6.
And that's interesting too, because as you're saying that, I'm thinking like that the first emergence of that is really on the physical level. People want to physically be better.
That's right.
Do yoga, do this, do extra gym work, all those things.
Improve
the look of the body.
Exactly.
And then that sort of moved further and further inside into health and well-being from the inside out, and then emotional health and well-being as well, and psychological, spiritual even health and well-being as it advances.
Exactly. So there's been a rapid expansion of alternative healing modalities, for example. And we are looking to adapt ourselves to fit with what the world's demanding from us, to adapt to what our community's asking of us, what nature's asking of us, the whole planet, as a general theme. So there are the general themes of the emergent layer 6, and shortly we'll dive into some deeper examples of how they're showing up in the outside world. I just want to talk briefly about layer 7, because if we look at the time scale of the emergence of these new layers of consciousness, or these all of the layers of consciousness throughout history, actually, we can see that the time period between the emergence of one and then the emergence of the next one has slowly got shorter and shorter and shorter. And certainly one of the reasons for this is that change happens according to the speed of the available communications technology. So when there was no communication technology other than
pigeons,
talking or cave painting,
painting.
The sort of speed of change was rather slow. If somebody came up with a new way to light a fire, then it kind of didn't spread around the world very quickly at all. But then we went to riding horses and sailing boats on the ocean, and of course now we have our more or less instant electronic communication.
The British are coming! The British are coming!
That's right. So if somebody figures out a better way to light a fire on the other side of the world, then we can know about it straight away pretty much. And consequently, the paradigms, in other words, the period of time that we live according to one particular set of human values, they're getting shorter and shorter and shorter. And so we don't really have a lot of solid evidence for the timescales of the earlier paradigms. I think the best guess we can make around the agricultural era was maybe roughly from about 10,000 years ago through to the scientific industrial revolutions. So certainly thousands of years, roughly 10,000 of years. Then we look at the scientific industrial era, roughly 300 years. From its sort of full emergence to its current collapse. And if we do a bit of a kind of a mathematical analysis of these timescales, then really speaking, the sixth layer, so this emergent network-centric humanistic way of being human, ought to really only hang around as a fairly dominant paradigm for about a couple of decades, 20
generational,
years.
so.
Yeah. And then going on the same mathematical trajectory, what that means is that by the time that this network-centric humanistic way of being a human reaches full flight on a planetary level, it's probably only going to be less than 2 years before the next paradigm actually steps up and becomes dominant. And that next paradigm is not just any old paradigm, of course.
Not just any old paradigm, folks.
This is the quantum shift that many people have been talking about for a long time. So
all the rules change.
Everything changes. And so I'm starting to think that we're probably not going to see any obvious dominance of layer 6 at a global level. I think what we're going to do is we're going to go into this mushy period of change where things get rather chaotic and fairly confusing, and the influence of layer 6 is certainly going to increase and increase and increase, but at the same time we're going to have the layer 7 influence rocketing up. And because of the capacity inherent in human consciousness from the 7th layer, the influence that it's going to have is logarithmic, basically. It's on a logarithmic scale. So a very small percentage of people moving to this emergent integrative way of being human at layer 7 are going to have an extraordinarily large effect on humanity, on the technology that's produced, and its influence on global life.
Indeed.
So it's going to be a very interesting time indeed, and a time of very intense, compressed change, and it's already starting. You can feel it out there on the streets.
Well, can you feel it, folks? Let's hope you can. And any comments, as I said, 04 373 4119. We have a couple of texts. I'll come back to them in a minute. On Future Sense, it's 9:41.
For all of you out there, strangers in a strange land, you're grokking Future Sense here on Bay FM.
Yes. Please subscribe to Bay FM. We're coming up to the Radiothon, and it's a good time to subscribe early if you're interested in Splendor in the Grass, and subscribe anyway, because you should, and if you don't, we'll be after you in August. How you doing? We're having fun here. We're feeling a bit looser today. I don't know why, just as it is, somehow. Well, that's me, maybe. I'm just talking.
The royal we.
The royal we. Sorry about that. The royal we. We're talking about positive change on the planet and looking at all sorts of factors. And just quickly a text, one of the texts that came in worth responding to. Hi guys, what effect to the rest of the world do you think there will be when stage 5 is the dominant paradigm in mainland China? We're referring to what we were talking about before.
It's a really good question, and I guess we don't know. We've got to wait and see how that pans out. One of the interesting factors is that what we're seeing is an emergence of these more complex value sets in the West. So even though China is obviously becoming more powerful in terms of its trade capacity and wealth and those sorts of things, it's not going to be the most complex country on earth in terms of its mix of higher order human values, in terms of like the network centric way of thinking that's clearly emerged first in Northern Europe, really, and now we're seeing that spread to America and other Western countries, and certainly China has some of that happening as well. So it's hard to talk in a general sense about these things because they are so complex, and it doesn't matter which particular example I give, there are always going to be exceptions in that particular country. So
Yes.
just take this with a grain of salt.
Yes.
It's a generalization. But the emerging value set, the humanistic network centric, one of the key characteristics of it is its peacefulness, in terms of seeking inner peace and also seeking to reduce conflict and violence in the outer world. So as China rises and becomes more powerful, it's going to be rising within a world where there is potentially a dominance of this particular peaceful outlook, and that's got to filter back into China somehow.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Whereas that hasn't been the case for America. So as America has risen as one of the the earliest examples of the modern scientific industrial way of being human, and then grown into this powerhouse that it is now in various ways, it's done that in the context of a world, the rest of the world being mostly immersed in less complex value sets. Okay, so whereas it's been very easy for America to be dominant in that context. China, it won't be in the same situation. China will be powerful without a doubt, but it will be powerful within the context of a world that is, let's hope, overwhelmingly dominated by peaceful values. And so I think the need for exploratory violence that we've seen through the last couple of 100 years.
Exploratory violence, that's a nice way of putting it.
Is going to be lower, and we should be living in a world that is overall more peaceful. And we've got a rather chaotic period of change coming to get to the other side, to that, what I'm just talking about there. But I'm optimistic, about how that's going to show up, and I'm optimistic about how China is going to show up in the world. And I think one of the interesting characteristics of China is that internally, historically, it's always had a big job on its hands to keep the peace and get all of those little subcultures that it's got happening inside its boundaries working together. And I think that internal need to bring cohesion and internal peace hopefully will also shape how it shows up in the outside world as well.
You've been listening to Future Sense, a podcast edited from the radio show of the same name, broadcast on Bay FM in Byron Bay, Australia, at bayfm.org. Future Sense is available on iTunes and SoundCloud. The future is here now. It's just not evenly distributed.